Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. I am Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. We are officially over 2 years in the programs in this series. Past programs have included California's First People, Then and Now, the Sinold Water Temple, and last month, museum curator and local historian Beverly Lane told us about James Whit Doherty and his influence on the San Ramon Valley. In keeping with the museum's current exhibition, Her Side of the Story, California Pioneer Women, which closes after this weekend, so if you're going to make it, you're going to have to rush. Author, college professor, and director of Alta Mesa Center for the Arts, Mary Vollmer, will explore how the interplay of fiction and history allows us to include women's voices in the history of the Gold Rush era, and tell us about the women that helped set up the Gold Rush region. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in questions at any time during the presentation, and we will address them at the end. We're doing things a little bit differently today. Mary and I will share the program in a sort of a conversational style. So you'll see both of us. And so at this point, I would like to invite Mary in. Mary Vollmer.
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much.
Mary.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's good to see you. We'll get this better. We won't overlap the entire time, I promise. But I'd also like to thank John for the invitation and the Museum of San Ramon Valley for taking an interest in the lost voices of history, which include eons of women, really. I am going to talk about women of the California Gold Rush, but first, I'd love to just say how I even had an interest in the first place. I played basketball in college. I studied English. I had no formal history and still have no formal history credentials. But after college, I went to the University of Wales on a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship. And part of that scholarship meant that I would travel up and down the Welsh coast visiting Rotary clubs, talking about the two things, basketball of all things, and California history, of which I knew about as much as your average fourth grader who had completed the fourth grade curriculum. But I didn't have an encyclopedic knowledge. I did my due diligence. I went to the library, I studied up. And what I offered, the room full of mostly male Rotarians, because at the time, very few women, if any, were inducted into Rotary clubs in Wales, was a dry, relatively laborious series of dates and stories that seemed old and known. Until one day, one of the husbands brought their wives. And one of the women in the back raised their hands and said, "What about the women? Weren't there any women in the Gold Rush?" And probably the most shocking thing about the question is that I had never thought to ask it, especially as a basketball player, as a woman basketball player who spent her whole youth playing with courts full of boys and men, being the only women. So that took me back to the library. And what I found, not in the textbooks, but in the journals and the letters home and a lot of the primary text marriage records, was a whole ocean of stories waiting to be discovered. And that's what sent me back to a diligent study of the Gold Rush, which ended up becoming a novel, but also I do teach a class, Women of the California Gold Rush at St. Mary's. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to take you through a mini version of that semester-long class. We're going to do a crash course right now, and I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see this again. And Dan and I are going to just kind of go back and forth a bit, but I'll talk as well. Okay, so imagining history's lost voices. Dan.
Before Mary, now that she's apologized for her lack of knowledge, this is the novel that Mary has written, Crown of Dust. It is set in the mining camps of the Gold Rush era. A number of the characters are women. I'm not going to give away this story, but she does just a great job. If anybody's interested in this era, she did a great job of bringing the flavor of the mining camp and representing a lot of the women that you're going to see popping up in Mary's slideshow. So, crown of dust. There it is.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
Mary.
should say the other part of my curiosity about the time is here I was in Wales, living among standing stones in a history older than my whole country. And that made me quite curious about the history that I didn't know about the place I grew up in. And I'm a Grass Valley kid. The mines, the Pelton wheels are downtown, just like the standing stones were in the place I was living in Wales. So there's things that bring you back to history and things that can take you away that you'll have to study on your own. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to give kind of an outline, a very broad summary about the time of the gold rush. Then we're going to talk about what is it that brought the young men and the women west. Then we're going to take a closer look at a few women, just a few women whose names we do remember now. And then I'll give you some homework. And I'll give you a bit of homework right now before we begin. And that is listen to people I am not mentioning. Listen to the gaps in the history that I am relating, and let that be an invitation to you to do your own homework and go back and to find the stories that have yet to be discovered about the gold rush, but about history in general. So, snapshot of the moment, 1848, it was a mess. It was a global chaos. You think we're in a mess now? Well, but not the first time. 1848 featured revolutions all over Europe. And we're not just talking political revolutions, but intellectual and social movements that were disrupting life as they know it all across the continent. The March Revolution in Germany, for example, in 1848 was trying to unseat the aristocracy. And all the way through that landscape, you had a tremendous unrest. You also had, at the same time, famines in Ireland that many of you already know about. You also have wars and famines in China, especially in Southeast China, that were making people desperate and hopeful. I think desperation and hope often goes hand in hand. At the same time, in American history, you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is opening up, uninhabited, in quotes, land from most of the West, Texas and California and Utah and Arizona and New Mexico and parts of Colorado are being ceded to the United States. And that landscape is opening up for colonization. You also have the American unrest. You have the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, which is the first convention that is demanding suffrage for women throughout the United States. And then 24th of January, 1848, John Marshall discovers an ingot of gold in Sutter's Fort near Coloma, California. Now, he didn't say anything about this find because he knew what we all know now, that mention of the word gold would send the world, which was already in a state of chaos, into a frenzy. And that's exactly what happened when finally word of gold translated around the country, and then the world rushed in. W.H. Brands has a book of that title talking about the mass migration, one of the biggest mass migrations we have ever seen per capita, if you look at the percentages. So 1847, non-native Californian inhabitants, highlight that word, non-native California inhabitants, 8,000 people total. In less than 2 or 3 years, 90,000 people descended on California, 92% of them male. You can imagine, I'm just trying to imagine that, 92,000, 92% male. By 1860, 400,000 people had immigrated from all over the world. Keep in mind the chaos that we've seen, famines and revolutions and unrest. People are desperate. And when they're desperate, they look for any sign of hope. And that gold was that hope. Now, I've highlighted for you a number at the bottom of this page. At the time in 1847, just before gold was discovered, there was 150,000 native Californians, probably more than that, probably more than that. By 1860, that number was 30,000 and dropping. So the consequences of this rush and this frenzy were tremendous. And those two are voices that we need to honor. As I sit here now, I sit on Ohlone land, and I'm conscious of that as well. So what did it mean? What is this wealth we're talking about? $10 million in the first year were discovered. And I'm not talking about corporate mining, a bunch of people with big machines. I'm talking about guys with gold pans on their knees in the river, which is alluvial mining, which is different from hard rock mining, takes almost no capital. About $362 million was the take today. It's a tremendous amount of wealth. By 1860, $465 million were taken in gold from the gold rush. This is just in gold. This is not in all the other amenities that had to be bought and sold in order to support these miners. That's about $17 billion today. To put that in context, because it's hard to kind of think in numbers like that, if you were a day laborer in the Erie Canal at that same time, you'd be about 88 cents a day, under $1. In the California gold rush, for the same labor, you could make about $20 a day, because an ounce of gold was about $16 at the time. As now, inflation was a ridiculous reality. It was a reality, and we'll talk about that in relation to women in the gold rush in just a minute. All right, so this is one of my favorite paintings. It's by Charles Nash, or Charles Nahl, N-A-H-L. I last time I said Steve Nash, like, no, he's a basketball coach. You know, Charles Nahl. You can find this in the Crocker Museum in Sacramento, and it's called Sunday Morning in the Mines, and it depicts this kind of frontier culture, male culture during the gold rush. And one of the things I want to call your attention to in this painting is the lack of judgment. The guys in the right-hand side there, they're reading the Bible, they're being very moral and very demure and contemplative, but they take no more space than the guys having a horse race on the left side and the drunken stupor in the middle. In fact, the drunken stupor is in the middle of the painting. So you have this huge influx of people from all over the world, none of whom share the same religious backgrounds or institutional backgrounds. They're coming to a place that lack all the institutions that grew them up. They also lack their mamas and their aunts and their sisters to keep them in line. And by the way, look on that right-hand side of the painting, sew their clothing back together. So it's a utopic, but it's also a chaotic a men's club kind of an experience.
You and I have talked about this one, and it's funny that you picked this painting, because I used it in a gold rush exhibit that I had done some years ago. And we paired it with a quote from Mark Twain, which he's talking about the mining camps, because that's where he is at the moment. And it's from his book, Roughing It. And he's talking about what you see in the painting, the male miners. And here's the quote: "They fairly reveled in gold and whiskey, fights and fandangos, and they were unspeakably happy."
Yeah. And that happiness, there was a great deal of energy during the gold rush. There was also a great deal of loss, because lots of the men, probably most, I'm not sure, I don't have the numbers on that, who went west to make their fortune, did not find it. The rush of alluvial gold you could just find in the river, that lasted less than 2 years. After which it was the myth and the draw of the gold rush that brought them west. And I think you see that again today. We have gold rush after gold rush in California. Hollywood is a kind of gold rush. Come discover your identity, become famous. The Silicon Valley, the dot-com boom was another kind of gold rush, and followed a similar pattern of a rush in and then an inevitable fall because you can't sustain that kind of activity that long.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Mary, and I think in your book, in the novel, you point some of this out, that a lot of these folks were kind of inventing themselves during the time. And I think a lot of them had intended to go home again at some point. But circumstances being as they are, a lot of them don't find the riches that they thought they were going to find and never make it back home again.
Right. That is the case. That is the case. And how many of us actually find what we go out seeking? I think most of us find something else, something better, something unexpected at the very least. But gold was the draw, but it wasn't necessarily what they found.
Mm-hmm.
So joining these men, remember that raucous photograph, were the numbers say there's 8% women, 92% men. Those numbers are skewed. They did not count all the prostitutes. They did not count women of color. There's a lot of people they didn't count. So I don't actually know the number of women who were in the West and Californios as well, and who were in California before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So we're going to take a look at who these women were. This is a smattering. On the left side of your screen there is a woman named Georgiana Bruce Kirby, who came west with a woman named Eliza Farnham, both of them reformers. Eliza Farnham of great fame, and we're not even going to talk about her. So write that down in your notes, Eliza Farnham, and look her up because she was a remarkable woman, and both of them settled in Santa Cruz and homesteaded there for a while. The bottom of your screen on the left there is what the conception was. Why do you need women in the first place? Well, the idea was that women would civilize the men, that they were the civilizing influence. And so in order to solve all the social problems of the West, women like Eliza Farnham said, well, we'll send women. And she actually hired a boat with 250 berths for women, and only 2 showed up to go west. Maybe they figured out maybe that's not a good idea to go with all these men. But there was a great demand for women. And women were celebrated when they were there, and of course objectified. You can see the bottom right-hand picture there. There were also a large number of prostitutes from all over the world, some of whom were relatively well off, and the great majority, however, were treated terribly, including many indentured Chinese girls who were put into sexual slavery and sent west. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these people now. And the first one on my list is this woman, a woman of business, Losina Wilson. And I love Losina. I think Losina should be in every 4th grade curriculum. I know it's in some because I've taken a look. And the 4th grade, by the way, is when California children learn about the gold rush. So Losina Wilson was born a Quaker. She moved to Missouri and married her husband, Mason, there. Mason decides, hey, I'm going west. Losina has 2 small children. She says, hey, Mason, I'm going with you. And they do. She packs up and goes all along the Overland Trail, which, by the way, took at least 3 months to complete if everything went well, right? Imagine going to Sacramento. If those of you who are in Danville, San Ramon area, you're going to Sacramento. Okay, if you're going on a Friday night, that's going to take you 3 hours. If you're going on a Friday morning, maybe an hour and a half. So the circumstances of those trips were so varied that 3 months was an underestimate. If you were going by sea, by the way, it would take you about the same time if you were going down around Cape Horn and up. So here she goes.
I've got a perspective on this one that somebody gave me. I was flying cross country back in the days when the pilots would talk to you. We were over the Midwest, kind of following the Platte River, and he came on and he said, he told us where we were, and then he said, I just want you to know at our current airspeed, this plane covers in 2 minutes about the same distance that a wagon train would be able to make on a good day.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I'm going to remember that because it does speak about the amount of time people placed in the overland trail. And as you said, the sea voyages were, if anything, equally dangerous, perhaps more, more expensive for people who aren't raised around the ocean, a little more scary. And so, people like Losina, I think we should stand and applaud. And I agree with you; she should be in these books.
Right. And if you, once you get there, you're not going to text home, "Hey, Ma, I made it." You know, if indeed you have what you need to write a letter, you have to find somebody who's going back. and even then, if it's going by sea or by land, it's very, very possible that correspondence is lost. So when we talk about why is it that it's so hard to kind of find information about women of this time, who were the primary correspondents back and forth between families, there's a lot of unpredictability in the mail. It's just very difficult. Virginia Woolf has a quote, and I'm gonna do it damage now, but she said the history of women is kept in the journals and the basically the underwear drawers of families worldwide. You know, and true. That's where you have to look for these kinds of details. But here she is, Losina, and she gets to California. Oh, I'm back. Let's go back. Don't get dizzy. Sorry.
There you go.
Okay, we're back to Losina. They finally arrive in California. Hubby goes off. He's going to go start mining. Losina's kids are hungry. She's going to sit down and she's going to try to make some kind of meal and some kind of home out of this tent camp. She sets up her stove. She makes biscuit, and into camp comes a disgruntled and bedraggled young man who probably is a bit terrifying to this woman who just has her kids and her husband's off. And before she can say anything, he says, I'll buy those biscuits that you made for $5. She's taken aback. She doesn't, it's not that she's saying no, she just can't believe he's offering $5. So he raises the price. He says, 10, I'll give you $10 for that biscuit. And some accounts say that he went as high as $20, which again, remember, is a living wage, a daily wage for somebody who's working in California. Losina's smart. She figures out real quick what a lot of entrepreneurs did in the West, is that they can make far more money off of miners than miners will ever make with all of their toil in the diggings. So she set up a table, and by the time her husband got back from the diggings, she had several men eating and paying for the privilege. And she set up then from then on a boarding house. She set up a boarding house in Sacramento until a flood came through and destroyed it. She went to Nevada City until a fire came through and destroyed it. She went to Vacaville. So you see this not only this pattern of entrepreneurial brilliance, but resilience that she showed throughout her life, even after her husband left her. And I don't know why that happened, because she seemed to be making the money, but I don't know. That's for some other scholar to know. But Losina Wilson, one of the business persons, she's just an example of the women who are doing work like this, domestic work, which in the East was unpaid entirely or worked as an exchange. So keep that in mind. The labor and work that women had done in the East suddenly had great value in the West.
I wonder how many women in the gold rush learned from Losina what you just said about the fact that someone with some type of skill that would be valued by a bunch of guys in the mines could do so much better than somebody who was doing the daily digging and the daily chopping at the face of a cliff.
You know, I think a lot of people figured it out, including a man named Sam Brennan, I think that's his name, who lived and worked in San Francisco. And he wanted to import carpet for all of these new buildings coming up, and did that for a while, but everything kept burning down. And it's expensive to buy and import carpets. They're heavy. So he figured out, well, what if I import carpet tacks, the thing you need just to put the carpets down? And he cornered the market on market tacks and became rich off of these tiny pieces that were easy to import, easy to create. so that kind of, that get rich quick mentality, which I'm not saying is entirely virtuous. It's emblematic of the kind of thinking that was forming the place at the time.
Yeah, and it's an interesting pivot, because every time that the town burns down, and they do, you need more carpet tax.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're facing conflagulations, the 19th century term, all the time now. When that kind of resilience is something we might be able to learn from.
Yeah, true.
We also have, now when I teach women of the California Gold Rush and I ask, why did you take this class? So many want to learn about prostitutes. And there were a large number of prostitutes in the West, in part because you could drive a high price for a business that would not lend that same high price in the East. What is rare is precious. Joanne Levy would say that. Her book, They Saw the Elephant, was one of the first books about women of the California Gold Rush. And that's true. What is rare is precious. So there were prostitutes in most every large town. Remember, these guys were away from their mothers, 92% men, all away from their moms and wives and mistresses. They're horny. They are ready, and they're willing to pay, and they have money to pay. Now, the life of the prostitute is varied, and you know, the misconception, or the kind of the stereotype I think we have in the West is the prostitute with a heart of gold. You know, the happy, plump, healthy woman who's not only serving men but caring for them in some way. But it was a business, and a madam would have her employees working for her. She could make as much as $400 a night off the labors of the women working for her. On the other extreme, you had what they're called cribs, and some Chinese indentured girls brought in for this purpose would see upwards of 50 men a night in very awful conditions, and probably wouldn't live beyond 2 years. The life expectancy was very short for these women. Venereal disease was not unknown at the time. It was rapid through these areas as well. So again, get rich quick, but at what cost? And if you did, in fact, own your own body, which most prostitutes did not, they were working for someone else, that was a possibility, and it was a jumping off point for some women. One of the characters in my book, named Emmeline, started this way, and it was a jumping off point. It didn't also carry the same judgment that it did in the East. And in fact, we have California now, this liberal place, but this began, I think, during the gold rush, when there were no institutions to kind of govern behavior in the same way. And by the way, please go ahead and use that chat for questions, because half the fun is answering questions at the end. You have entertainers during the gold rush. Now, I'm going to get her name right, and I wrote it down because it's so complicated. Okay, meet Lola Montz, who was born as Eliza Rosanna Gilbert in Sligo, Ireland. She's also known as the Countess of Lansfeld. She was both an entertainer and an entrepreneur. She was not Catholic in Ireland. She left for London to pursue a career in dancing, discovered that her talent as a courtesan greatly outmatched her talents as an entertainer, and then went to Europe to pursue other stages, I guess, is what, and this is a pattern she followed her whole life. She became mistress of people like Alexander Dumas in that kind of artistic circle, and eventually made her way to what is now Germany and Prussia, Bavaria, where the king of Bavaria, King Ludwig, made her his mistress. And he made her the Countess of Lansfeld, which pleased her to no end, but did not please the people he was meant to be serving. They were never happy with this eccentric woman that he had as his mistress. Now, remember back into those earlier slides, all of the unrest in 1848. Lola is born in 1820. She goes to Europe in 1844. What happens in 1848? revolutions all over Europe. The aristocracy is called into question. Lola says, I got to get out of here, and does. Where does she go? Well, what's the place that has the greatest wealth and the newest stage? And that's California. So she's one of these entertainers who went west. Now, she was known for her eccentric performances. And one of these, if we were in person, I would perform for you within reason. You'll have to imagine. Here's Lola coming on stage with lots of sumptuous clothing on, and oh my, she discovers a spider in one of her layers, and off comes a layer. She dances to the left, she dances to the right. Another spider. Those darn spiders are everywhere. She proceeds to do the spider dance, as it was known, until she has very, very little left on to invite those spiders. And the men in the audience, and they were mostly men, were thrilled, and they were throwing money on the stage. So this was the notorious entertainment that you might enjoy in California. And for a while, a lot of entertainers who were kind of on their way out or on their way up would start in California stages, because it was easy to please, I suppose, and worth your while if you could do it. She moved to Grass Valley, where I'm from. I remember going by her house when I was a kid, being underwhelmed by the house, but now I understand why it's a landmark. And she did very well. She also mentored other entertainers during this time, but when the next gold rush in Australia came, she went too. So she followed to the newest stage and to the most wealth. Throughout her very short life, she ended her life ended at 39, probably from syphilis. But we're not sure exactly. Dan, there's a monument to Lola, isn't there, in San Francisco?
In San Francisco, yeah.
Market or
Street,
Mission?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we in the chat, and I didn't capture the name, but let's give the credit. Okay, so Gail told us that there's a number of places up around Donner Lake that have Lola's name on them. And she is exactly as described. She is basically almost like a global personality. She's known everywhere, and finds a need and fills it.
Yeah, as known as Mark Twain and those kinds of figureheads at the time.
Yeah.
And isn't it interesting? They were all in these tiny, what are now tiny gold rush towns in Grass Valley and Nevada City, that are still probably living off of the patina of that rush. I don't know that.
Yeah, exactly.
Living in the past. So that's Lola. And we'll move on to one of my favorite people, and I wish I knew more about her. And I invite you to learn more about her, Mary Ellen Pleasant. So she was born in 1815 into slavery somewhere, probably Georgia. We don't know. She might have been the daughter of a wealthy landowner. She might have been the daughter of a voodoo queen. I say might because the stories about her life are varied, and she cultivated many of these stories for her own purposes. She decided, well, the audience that she wanted to please, and told you the story that she thought you needed to hear about her becomings. Some things are known. She was put into indentured servitude in the Northeast and was educated there. When she was up there, she got into a relationship with abolitionists and married one. She was very deeply invested in the abolitionist effort and the Underground Railroad. When it got hot, when they started persecuting abolitionists, she went west to California and landed in San Francisco. Her activism did not end then. She, in fact, became even more active in several causes, including the cause of John Brown at Harper's Ferry. She would send money, and I'm not sure she went. Some accounts say that she went and helped him in person. Don't know for sure. But she made her money because she, along with learning how to read and write in the Northeast, learned to be a cook and was highly sought after by some of the biggest men in San Francisco. So not only did she cook, but she cultivated the flavors, but she also cultivated the secrets of these very important men and used them, doled them out when necessary for any purpose that she saw a need for. They would call her Black City Hall, because if you had something that you needed in San Francisco, Mary Ellen Pleasant was the one who could get it for you. In 1866, she started a campaign to desegregate the trolleys and took that case all the way to the Supreme Court and won. So she's also known as the mother of civil rights, not just in California, but nationwide. Now, so we still don't know everything about her. And she cultivated this mystery because it served her. And that's also one of the difficulties of writing a person like this. There's some great books. Karen Joy Fowler's Sister Noon has Mary Ellen Pleasant as kind of a central character. But as a historical personage, she's hard to pin down.
You know, this is something that I think is consistently interesting for me, is the way people were able to invent themselves as necessary and change their inventions as necessary when circumstances favored them. I'm looking again at your book, and a lot of the characters in your book are exactly that. We know some things about those folks. They seem to be able to kind of shed skin at various times and adopt something else when it works, if for whatever is happening to them. And people like Mary Ellen really demonstrate that well.
Yeah, she was an inspiration on one of the main characters, Emily, because of the way she knew and navigated the social world.
Yeah.
But when I was writing that book, I'd written the whole book in the in the present tense third person, which I didn't know at the time was a little weird. Like, why would you do that? Sometimes you can write in the first person present tense, but I'd written the whole book in third person present tense. But as I sat back and wondered what I had been thinking, that myth of reinvention, of the ability to live in a constantly evolving present tense, where you can recreate yourself and deny anything of the past. Nobody knew who your daddy was. That was a primary myth of the California Gold Rush. Probably exists today on Facebook, right? You can cultivate your own persona and put it forth and try to deny everything else, all of the wrinkles and the warts that also make you who you are.
I think they call those dating apps as well. Yeah.
Well, we were talking earlier about, and we really haven't talked, well, what is it that brought women west to California yet? And that, let's think about the time. You have 92% men. If you're a woman in this time, you have one profession, two actually. You could either be a wife or a prostitute, right? There's your choices. So if you're going to find marriageable men, and there's a scarcity in the East, which after the Civil War, hundreds and thousands of lives lost, there certainly were. And so the women went west. They were seeking the MRS degree, which was what my mom called it in the 70s, because there was no other avenues open to them. But when they arrived in California, they met women and they heard of women like Mary Ellen Pleasant, like Losina Wilson. California was unique in that the West, in fact, was unique in that it opened up women's rights long before the East did. Wyoming was the first state to allow women's suffrage. And they were doing that because they were trying to get women to come. They were trying to say, look, we need you, we want you, and this is how we prove it. We give you rights of a full human being, go figure. Then we have Josephine Segovia. Some people know her as Juanita. That was not her given name. We don't know for sure that Josepha was her given name. She has the pleasure, I guess, of being the first and only woman hung in California. She was from Sonora, Mexico, probably. She probably came with a man named Jose, who might have been her partner, might have been her husband, we don't know. But she was in Downeyville, and on July 4th, there was a huge raucous party. All the miners were drunk and shooting off whatever they had, and it was a mess. Well, into the cabin that night on the 4th came a drunk young man. Now, this is where the stories diverge. What happened? In some stories, he comes in, he accosts her, she says no, he says, oh, my bad, leaves. The next day, she sees him and stabs him dead. That's one story. The other story is he stumbles in at night, accosts her, she says no, he ignores her, she stabs him. Whatever the right story is, and forgive me, I'm guessing one sounds more plausible than the other. She's taken by a vigilante mob the next day on the 5th, tried, not by a jury of her peers by any stretch, and condemned to hang. And when she steps onto the scaffold, all accounts agree that she does so with great spite and great dignity. I don't know how to read that story. Is that a heroic moment? It's certainly a tragedy. But she now is one of the few women who exists in our histories because of this act. So and again, if you're hearing about someone you want to know more about, good. That's exactly what I'm hoping, that you go back. And if you're also hearing, for instance, about Chinese women that I haven't put in the presentation, also good. Go back and look and find these voices, because it does no good for one person to imagine the many histories we've ignored. If we keep on going back with our own curiosity, we're gonna make a more complete picture. So there's lots of wonderful books. I've just given you a few here. And also, if you want, you can either put it in the chat, your email, or I'll put my email in the chat so that you can ask me for the list, the bibliography. These are just some of the books. They Saw the Elephant by Joanne Levy it was one of the first books that even asked the question, who were the women of the California Gold Rush? Susan Lee Johnson in the middle there, her focus is more is also California and Colorado, but focused on California. And it was in her book that I found the main character of that book Dan is talking about, Crown of Dust. You open about the middle of the book and there's a picture of an androgynous looking person. It's either a young boy or a young woman dressed as a young boy. And that was the character, that was the image that birthed my character, Alex, who comes to this gold rush town dressed as a boy, running from, I won't tell you. You'd have to read the book.
No, don't.
But a lot of wonderful books now. The Shirley letters, if you want a firsthand account of the time, the Shirley letters are funny. They're raucous. There was a opera in San Francisco a couple years ago based on the Shirley letters. Yep. Keep in mind that Shirley is writing for an audience. These are not private journals. So she's being honest, but perhaps not as honest as she might do. There's another one that's not on this list called by Sarah Royce, who was Josiah Royce's mother. A Victorian woman on the frontier. I'm getting it wrong. I'll look at the source, but it's told in retrospect. So she's maybe 1880, and she's looking back at the experience, and the whole experience is kind of remembered in the glow of reflection. So everything had a purpose, and there was a real religious overtone to the whole thing that I wonder in the moment if she felt, because the real terrors that she encountered, it would be hard to stay grounded in reflective and contemplative calm with which she writes that book. So
And
I think
before
I
you
think
get
I'm
off,
open for questions. Yeah, Dan.
well, before you get off the slide,
Yeah.
one of the things that kind of I always thought of with the gold rush is what a global event it was.
Yeah.
And I think the Western movies kind of do a bit of a disservice to us. Your book includes a number of different people. A lot of the diverse people that are in your book are the men, but there are a couple of women in here as well. And when you were talking about like Pleasant and others, so what's kind of your, why are there so many holes in this? I think you alluded earlier that women weren't writing for newspapers, they weren't writing for weekly magazines, they were writing for diaries and things that, as you said, were going to wind up in the bottom of a drawer,
Yeah.
and up to historians to find them and do the right thing by them. So, what is your
Well,
thinking about?
there were quite a few of Hawthorne's scribbling women, he spoke about with scorn, who were writing mysteries and writing novels and probably selling a lot more than he was at the time. But those haven't been the books that we've kept in the canon. Those were not the ones we brought forward as examples, even though when I teach Women of the California Gold Rush, you discover powerful voices, powerful stories, like Mary Hollick Foote, who was the model for Stegner's Angle of Repose. And in fact, her journals were, I don't know what the word except plagiarized by him in that book, which is still one of my favorites. And, who is writing the history and what is deemed important? Women were not writing the history at the time, and it was a long time before they were. So that experience, that domestic experience, the daily life of the gold rush is recounted quite brilliantly in some of those journals. But that wasn't a war, and that wasn't a date of discovery or conquest, which makes it into what we know as history, which is a very narrow realm of existence, really.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that a lot of those first person reminiscences of whatever it is, at least in my mind, for history, become really important. They give you a much better flavor of the time and what the average person was struggling with, than maybe the big picture, the great man stories, that kind of thing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there are journals of young men during the gold rush too, and they talk about the fandangos, and then they talk about who was going to dress up and be the woman tonight, and there was this great shifting of genders, even then, and they thought nothing about it. It was just the way they coped with the lack of women during the gold rush. The question too is, well, where do you find them? And you do find women in the journals. You find them in marriage ads. You find them in documents like the Missouri Matrimonial Times that was published for years after the Civil War. And again, more men in the West than are still alive in the East. So women would put ads that were answered by men or vice versa. And my favorite of these ads was, I can't remember her name, but I remember the language of her ad perfectly. It was 245, because there was number 245 ad. I'm fit, fat, and 45. Here I am. I'm ready to go west. She was quite aware that this was an economic exchange. She's not looking for love. There were a lot of warnings at the time that would say to men mostly, watch out, because you're going to order what you think is a good-looking woman, and a hag is going to arrive and steal all your money. And it was fun. It's a fun kind of research, looking into the cracks, and also talking to people whose mothers have drawers full of old letters, or there's a library in Nevada City I spent hours and hours and hours in, looking through old newspapers of the time, and hearing too in the newspapers the biases, and hearing the way words are put together, and hearing who's omitted from those reports. It's kind of a literary detectiveship.
Yeah, and Mary, I've got to say that thankfully that Wales tour that you made put you on this path, because we've certainly benefited from it today. And once again, I can recommend for anybody that's interested in the historical fiction period, but this book really does a great job, Crown of Dust, of talking about the camp. And I'm not going to give away the story either, but it's well worth somebody picking that book up. It'll start you on the same path. So
maybe I'll give you just a little taste of Emmeline, because she, if anybody gets you in the book, and Emmeline was not my main character, by the way. It was not my intention. She just took over. Yeah. So I'll just give you the first little page. Emmeline searches the sky for storm clouds from the doorway of the Victoria Inn. The man snoring at her feet grunts, rolls over and curls himself around an upturned bottle of whiskey. She picks up her skirt, steps over him onto the porch. Can't predict the weather this time of year. Fools even the wildflowers. Mistake 3 days of sunshine for the start of May, when one hard freeze will snap the petals right off and kill the early batch of mosquitoes already swarming. Across the road, the chapel's canvas roof sags like wet clothes on a line. It won't take another snow like the last. Klein promised to fix the damn thing, but he's probably knee-deep in the creek with the rest of them. It's no wonder nobody in these parts has struck pay dirt yet, what with their canvas tents and frame cabins so easy to desert. Why would the earth give up its gold just to be abandoned on rumor of another strike? The soil is a shrewd old whore and has learned better than to give her gold for free. A person should have a solid foundation, Emmeline always says, some sort of permanence in her life, a place for luck to grow. And I'll stop there, but you can kind of get a sense of, this voice that came out of a lot of the reading and a lot of the journals that it just came, and it came in the book and took over the book. I'm looking at the chat now. There's so many good responses in the chat, and I don't want to miss them. Yeah. Frog music. Tiff Dresden talks about a book called Frog Music. We should I'm going to make a note so that I can send all of these books out too as well. Yeah, Ann P, I agree. They Saw the Elephant was amazing, and that an amazing undertaking too. When you talk to Joanne Levy about how she arrived at that story and how she pursued it, and how there were no sources when she began. I went and visited her because I was so grateful. You're so grateful that you burdened somebody with your presence. That's what I did. I drove out and bought her coffee and said thank you. Okay.
Mary, I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I have. I had a blast. And so I hope everybody watching this morning, according to the chat, because I've been watching it too, and a lot of people seem to have enjoyed it, and so that's really good. And I'd like to thank everybody for viewing this morning. If you missed any of our earlier programs, you can find them by visiting museum's website at museumsrv.org. Today's program will appear early next week. Join us on Thursday, June 16th at 11:30. I got to be honest, we have no idea what this program will be, but it'll be good, whatever it is. So make sure you tune in for that. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, clicking on the Donate Now button. Museum's also in need of volunteers. If you can give us some time, please contact the museum. A reminder for two things. Crown of Dust, great book. Grab it. And for
Can I say too, if you live in Danville, Rakestraw Books is your place to go. Michael is amazing, and Rakestraw is a treasure.
Okay.
Sorry.
And speaking of treasures, our exhibit on Her Side of the Story, California Pioneer Women, closes on Sunday, so the clock is ticking. I certainly hope that you enjoyed today's presentation, as I said earlier. Thank you, Mary. And thank you all for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dan.